The air was still and thick, a humid blanket that settled over the grand halls of Chapultepec Castle. Dust motes danced in the long shafts of afternoon light slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings and gilded frames of a forgotten era. It was a place of immense beauty and quiet power, perched high above Mexico City like a silent guardian. But on this particular day, a different kind of quiet had taken hold. It was the silence of anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm, a stillness so profound you could almost hear the thoughts of the men inside. The polished floors, so often echoing with the gentle patter of servants or the light footsteps of dignitaries, were now only disturbed by the slow, deliberate tread of one man. His name was Porfirio Díaz, and for over 30 years, his every step had been the rhythm of a nation. His figure, though aging, still carried the weight of command. He moved with a practiced slowness, his eyes, so used to seeing far into the distance, now focused on the small, intricate patterns on his desk. The room was his sanctum, filled with maps and documents detailing a Mexico that on the surface was a picture of progress. The railroads he had built crisscrossed the nation like new veins, carrying wealth from the mines and farms to the bustling ports. Foreign investors had poured money into the country, and the cities were growing, adorned with grand European-style architecture. For the elites, for the wealthy landowners, and the foreign capitalists, this era was a golden age, a period of order and prosperity that would forever be known as the Porfiriato. But outside the castle walls, a different kind of story was unfolding. The air that felt so still and peaceful here was beginning to crackle with tension, like a distant thunderstorm moving closer. Did you know that the very stability Porfirio Díaz cultivated for so long was built upon a foundation of simmering discontent and growing inequality? As the years passed, the gap between the rich and the poor had become a chasm. While the upper class enjoyed their newfound wealth and the trappings of modernity, the vast majority of Mexicans lived in abject poverty. The land, the very heart and soul of the nation, had been systematically taken from small-scale farmers and indigenous communities. Under laws designed to modernize Mexico, huge tracts of communal lands, known as ejidos, were sold off to a handful of powerful individuals and foreign companies. These hacienda owners created vast estates, and the farmers who had once worked their own plots were forced to become debt peons, essentially serfs tied to the land and their masters through an unbreakable cycle of debt. They toiled in the fields from dawn till dusk, their lives a monotonous repetition of labor and want. The government of Don Porfirio, as he was often called, saw this as progress, a necessary step toward building a modern, capitalist state. But for the peasants, it was a profound and painful injustice. It was a classic, good for me, not for thee situation, and the thee was getting very, very tired of it. In the northern states, the issue was slightly different, but no less explosive. Here, large cattle ranches and mining operations dominated the landscape. While some workers found employment, it was often under brutal conditions with little pay. The resentment simmered, particularly among those who had lost their traditional ways of life and their ancestral lands. Life under Díaz was, for most, a predictable routine of hardship, with little hope for change. The political system, too, was a perfect reflection of this stagnation. Though Mexico had a constitution, it was in practice a document of suggestion. Elections were held, but the outcomes were never in doubt. Diaz would simply announce his candidacy, and a carefully orchestrated campaign would ensure his victory time and again. The nation became a silent partner in this charade, or so it seemed. The press was controlled, dissent was suppressed, and any hint of organized opposition was swiftly and often brutally crushed. The rurales, a rural police force, were a constant menacing presence, a testament to the fact that order was maintained not by consent, but by force. It's almost like a really long, really boring game of musical chairs, but the music never stops, and there's only one chair. The air in the castle grew heavier as Diaz considered the latest reports. Whispers of discontent were growing louder, no longer just a murmur, but a rising chorus. He had handled such things before, of course, but this time felt different. The grievances were too widespread, the poverties too deep. The system he had so meticulously built was showing its first serious cracks. While the trains ran on time and the markets were full of imported goods, the spirit of the Mexican people was beginning to feel a deep, quiet hunger. A hunger not just for food, but for justice and dignity. This was the moment before the storm, the calm before the thunder. It was a moment of profound significance, a historical turning point that few recognized at the time, but which would forever alter the course of a nation. The people of Mexico, for all their suffering, had not yet been united by a single purpose, but the seeds of that unity had been sown. They were in the dusty fields of the South, in the rugged ranches of the North, and in the crowded tenements of the cities. The Porfiriato, with all its outward displays of modernity, had failed to address the fundamental human need for equity and self-determination. It had created an imbalance so extreme that a rebalancing was not just inevitable, it was a historical necessity. And so, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, fading shadows across the polished floors of the castle, the stage was set for a conflict that would tear the nation apart, and in doing so, give birth to modern Mexico. The revolution was not yet a fact, but a palpable feeling, a collective sigh of a nation holding its breath. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love to see how far these stories travel. The quiet tension that had settled over Mexico like a thick fog would not last for long. A new kind of voice began to emerge from the silence, one that spoke not of violence or uprising, but of a quiet, almost scholarly revolution. This was the voice of Francisco Madero, a man born into immense wealth. Madero was a member of one of Mexico's most powerful and influential landowning families. He was, in many ways, an unlikely revolutionary. Madero had been educated abroad, in Paris and at the University of California at Berkeley, and he returned to Mexico not as a firebrand or a rabble-rouser, but as a gentleman farmer with a keen interest in politics and a gentle, almost timid demeanor. He was a vegetarian, a spiritualist, and a man of letters who believed in the power of ideas more than the force of arms. And in the world of Porfirio Díaz, a man who had built his empire On a foundation of political machinations and military strength, Madero was an anomaly. Madero's challenge to the dictator was not born from a peasant's rage or a soldier's ambition. It came from a deeply held conviction that Mexico's problems could be solved through peaceful, democratic means. He looked at the nation's political landscape and saw a stagnant, corrupt system that stifled progress and left no room for the will of the people. His political philosophy was rooted in the simple yet radical idea of effective suffrage, no re-election. This was his core belief, his mantra, and it was a direct challenge to the very foundation of the Porfiriato. Diaz had held power for decades, winning election after election, and Madero argued that this was the root cause of the nation's political and social ills. If the people could not choose their leaders, and if those leaders could remain in power indefinitely, then there was no check on their authority, no mechanism for change, and no hope for the disenfranchised. In 1908, a seemingly innocuous interview with an American journalist named James Creelman became a catalyst for change. In the interview, Diaz, perhaps weary of his long rule, or perhaps simply miscalculating the political climate, stated that Mexico was ready for democracy and that he would welcome an opposition party in the upcoming 1910 elections. For Madero, this was the opening he had been waiting for. He took the dictator at his word, and in 1909, he published his book, The Presidential Succession, in 1910. In this work, Madero laid out a detailed critique of the Diaz regime, not in a fire and brimstone tone, but with a measured intellectual calm. He advocated for a return to the principles of the Mexican Constitution and called for the formation of an opposition party. The book became a sensation, a literary hand grenade thrown into the quiet halls of Mexican politics. It was the first time in a generation that a public figure had so directly and intelligently challenged the dictator's authority, and it resonated with a nation that was desperate for a new direction. Madero's message was simple and for many deeply compelling. He wasn't promising land to the peasants or vast riches to the workers. Instead, he promised them something more fundamental, a voice. He promised them the right to choose their own destiny, the dignity of participation in their own government. And as he began to travel the country, campaigning for the presidency, he was met with a groundswell of support. The gentle, soft-spoken idealist began to attract crowds of thousands. People were drawn to his sincerity and his message of hope. They saw in him a stark contrast to the old, unyielding figure of Diaz, a man who had become an almost mythic figure of unchallengeable authority. Madero was human, approachable, and he spoke to their long-ignored desire for a more just society. Historians still debate whether Diaz truly intended to allow a free and fair election. Some argue it was a genuine moment of fatigue, while others see it as a political chess move, a way to test the waters and identify potential threats. Whatever his true motivation, the result was a miscalculation of historic proportions. The dictator, who had so carefully controlled every aspect of his nation's life, suddenly found himself facing a popular movement he could not ignore. The momentum behind Madero's campaign grew too large to contain. It was no longer just a political challenge. It was becoming a social phenomenon. The rallies were not just political gatherings. They were expressions of a collective yearning for change, a public acknowledgement of the widespread discontent that Diaz had tried so hard to suppress. The campaign tour was a remarkable journey. Madero traveled across vast distances, his speeches becoming the talk of the nation. He was met at every turn by crowds who were no longer afraid to show their support. This was a profound development in Mexican history. The fear that had kept the populace in check for decades was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, then an open hope. The old order was being challenged not by a bloody revolt, but by the simple act of people gathering, listening, and daring to dream of a different future. But Porfirio Díaz was not a man to give up power easily. As the 1910 elections drew near and it became clear that Madero might actually win, the old dictator's patience ran out. He decided to abandon the charade of democracy he had so briefly indulged in. Madero, in a move that seemed to defy all logic, was arrested just before the election on trumped-up charges of inciting rebellion. The election was held without him, and the outcome was as predictable as it was fraudulent. Diaz declared himself the winner once again, and the system returned to its stagnant, oppressive state. It was a clear, unambiguous message. The promise of democracy was an illusion, but in arresting Madero, Diaz had made his greatest mistake. He had not silenced a voice. He had created a martyr. The gentle, almost unassuming man who had advocated for peace and democracy was now transformed into the symbol of a nation's betrayed hopes. The stage was set, not for a peaceful transition, but for the violent conflagration that was to come. With Francisco Madero's arrest, the peaceful path to reform was suddenly and violently closed. Imprisoned in San Luis Potosí, Madero found himself at a crossroads. His non-violent campaign had been a powerful force, but it had ultimately failed to dislodge the entrenched power of the dictator Porfirio Díaz. It was at this moment, from within the confines of his jail cell, that the gentle idealist transformed into a revolutionary leader. Recognizing that the time for dialogue had passed, Madero drafted a document that would become the official battle cry of the revolution, the Plan of San Luis Potosí. The plan was a clear, concise, and direct call to arms. It declared the 1910 elections null and void due to their fraudulent nature, and declared Madero the provisional president of Mexico until new, legitimate elections could be held. But its most powerful and significant article was its invitation to armed rebellion. Madero called upon the Mexican people to rise up against the tyranny of Porfirio Díaz, setting the date and time for the revolution to begin 6 p.m. on November 20th, 1910. The plan was not just a political manifesto, it was a rallying cry, a final, desperate plea for a nation to take its destiny into its own hands. It was the moment the intellectual opposition became a full-blown revolution. Madero, after escaping from prison and fleeing to San Antonio, Texas, began to organize his forces from exile. He was a master of political organization, and he used his connections and his family's wealth to fund the initial stages of the movement. He wasn't a military man, and he knew it. His strategy wasn't to lead a grand army into battle, but to ignite a series of smaller and decentralized uprisings across the nation. The Plan of San Luis Potosí was the spark, and the people's widespread discontent was the tinder. He had a profound belief that the people themselves, once given the signal, would do the rest. He was betting on the collective frustration of a nation that had been silenced for over 30 years. And he was right. Historians still argue about the exact level of organization Madero had in place. Some say it was a carefully planned military operation with a clear chain of command, while others contend it was a more chaotic, spontaneous eruption of violence across the country. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Madero had indeed established contacts with various opposition groups, particularly in the northern states, where the sentiment against Diaz was strongest. He had communicated with men who were already restless, men who had their own grievances and their own followers. He had provided them with a date, a common cause, and a legitimate figurehead to rally behind. The genius of the plan was its simplicity. It did not demand a single, unified army. It simply asked for a multitude of separate revolts to begin at the same time, overwhelming the government's ability to respond. When November 20th, 1910 arrived, the revolution did not start with a single, dramatic explosion in Mexico City. Instead, it began as a series of small, scattered fires across the vast landscape of Mexico. In the southern state of Morelos, a small band of rebels under the command of a farmer named Emiliano Zapata took up arms. In the northern states, where the movement had more momentum, figures like Pascual Orozco and Francisco Villa began to gather their followers, seizing towns and disrupting the railroads that were the lifeblood of the Porfiriato. The government of Porfirio Díaz, so used to crushing isolated rebellions, found itself facing a widespread, decentralized, and unpredictable enemy. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a single bucket of water. The revolution's first phase was characterized by this kind of guerrilla warfare. The revolutionaries were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, ranchers, cowboys, and laborers who were driven by a common desire for change. They knew their local terrain, and they were masters of hit-and-run tactics. They would attack government garrisons, seize weapons and supplies, and then melt back into the rugged countryside, only to appear somewhere else a few days later. This made it incredibly difficult for the federal army to contain the uprising. They were fighting a phantom enemy, one that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The federales, as they were called, were often better armed and better trained, but they were no match for the revolutionaries' deep knowledge of the land and their unwavering resolve. Porfirio Díaz, from the quiet halls of his castle, initially dismissed the uprisings as a minor annoyance, another in a long line of insurrections he had easily put down. But as the news from the northern states grew more and more alarming, he began to realize the gravity of the situation. The revolutionaries were not just a few disgruntled bandits. They were an army of the people, and they were gaining support and momentum with every passing day. The very system he had built on a foundation of order and control was now coming undone at the seams. The railroads, once a symbol of his progress, were now being used by his enemies, their tracks ripped up to prevent the movement of federal troops. The telegraph lines, his method of communication and control, were being cut, leaving his government blind and deaf. The plan of San Luis Potosí with its seemingly simple call to action, had unleashed a force that no one, not even Madero himself, could have fully predicted. The revolution had begun, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small whispers that had suddenly found their collective voice. It was a testament to the power of a single idea and a single moment to change the course of history. As the revolutionary fire spread across Mexico, the northern states became a crucible of change, birthing a new kind of leader, the charismatic warrior. The vast, rugged landscapes of Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Sonora were perfect breeding grounds for rebellion, a place where the lines between cowboy, rancher, and revolutionary were often blurred. Two figures, in particular, would rise from this arid, untamed territory to become legends: Pascual Orozco and Francisco Pancho Villa. Though their stories would diverge dramatically, they initially rode together, two of the most effective generals in Madero's burgeoning army. Pascual Orozco, a former muleteer from the state of Chihuahua, was one of the first to answer Madero's call to arms. A man of quiet intensity and natural military talent, he was known for his remarkable organizational skills and his ability to win battles against the professional federal army. He had a deep understanding of the local terrain and a profound connection to the people. His early victories were crucial to the revolution's momentum in the North. He was a strategic thinker, not just a brawler, and his ability to move men and supplies across vast distances was a testament to his innate leadership. He captured important towns like Ciudad Guerrero and extended the revolutionary influence across the northern borderlands. Orozco's success was so pronounced that he was, for a time, considered the most powerful military figure in the North, perhaps even more so than Madero himself. The Plan of San Luis Potosí, remember, was a kind of a gentle suggestion, but Orozco was the one who was actually getting things done on the ground. But it was Pancho Villa, a man whose name would become synonymous with the Mexican Revolution, who captured the public imagination. Born Doroteo Arango, Villa was a complex and contradictory figure, a former bandit, a cattle rustler, and a man with a murky and violent past. He was also a brilliant military strategist, a Robin Hood figure to his followers, and a true believer in the revolutionary cause. Villa's charisma was legendary. He had a way of inspiring fierce loyalty in his men, the famous Villistas, who were a motley crew of cowboys, miners, and peasants. He commanded not just through authority, but through a genuine sense of camaraderie. He shared their hardships and their triumphs, and in return they would follow him anywhere. His military tactics were unorthodox and audacious. He was a master of the cavalry charge, using the wide-open spaces of the North to his advantage, striking with speed and ferocity before the enemy could react. The partnership between Orozco and Villa was at first a powerful one. Together, they formed the backbone of the Maderista army in the North. They coordinated their attacks, capturing key strategic points and systematically weakening the Diaz regime. Their greatest victory came with the capture of Ciudad Juarez, a major border city that was both a symbol of Diaz's power and a crucial port for revolutionary supplies. The siege of Ciudad Juarez was a dramatic and pivotal moment. Madero, still operating from exile across the border, was hesitant to attack such a heavily fortified city, but Orozco and Villa, with their characteristic boldness, convinced him to let them try. The battle was a resounding success. The federal troops, demoralized and outmaneuvered, surrendered, and the city fell to the revolutionaries. The victory sent shockwaves across the nation and was a clear signal that the revolution was no longer just a series of scattered uprisings. It was a legitimate and formidable military force. The fall of Ciudad Juarez was the beginning of the end for Porfirio Díaz. His 30-year reign, so carefully constructed on a foundation of control and order, was now crumbling under the weight of popular discontent and the relentless attacks of these northern warriors. The myth of his invincibility had been shattered. The dictator, who had so deftly managed to suppress every previous challenge to his authority, now found himself unable to contain the spread of the rebellion. His army was stretched thin, his generals were being defeated, and the political will to continue the fight was rapidly eroding. But as these victories piled up, a new kind of tension began to emerge within the revolutionary ranks. Madero, the gentle idealist, was increasingly at odds with his more pragmatic and ruthless generals. Orozco, who felt he deserved more credit for the military victories, began to harbor a growing resentment towards Madero. He felt his contributions were being overlooked in favor of the more famous Villa. This division, a quiet fissure in the foundation of the movement, would eventually lead to a new phase of conflict. Remember the peaceful promises of Madero's campaign? They were now bumping up against the harsh reality of war, where the men who fought and bled for the cause began to demand their own share of the spoils. Meanwhile, Villa, for all his revolutionary fervor, was still a bandit at heart. He was a man of action, not a man of policy. His loyalty was to Madero, yes, but it was also to his men and to his own vision of justice. And that vision was often at odds with the kind of orderly, democratic transition that Madero envisioned. The northern armies were a force of nature, a wild, unpredictable cavalry that had no interest in the niceties of political life. They were a necessary tool for the revolution, but they would also prove to be incredibly difficult to control. The capture of Ciudad Juarez had won the war against Diaz, but it had also set the stage for the next great conflict, the battle for the soul of the revolution itself. While the northern states were a whirlwind of cavalry charges and audacious victories, the revolution was taking on a different character in the south. In the rugged agrarian state of Morelos, a far more fundamental and deeply rooted conflict was unfolding. Here, the struggle was not about political reform or effective suffrage. It was a matter of survival, a fight for the very land that had sustained generations of families. The voice of this struggle was Emiliano Zapata. He was not a general with a grand vision for the nation, but a local hero, a man who had grown up watching his community suffer under the crushing weight of the hacienda system. He saw with his own eyes how the large sugar plantations, often owned by absentee landlords or foreign companies, were slowly but surely encroaching on the communal lands of his people. These lands, known as ejidos, were a central part of their identity and livelihood, and their systematic confiscation was a wound that ran deep. Zapata's early life was a microcosm of the peasant's plight. He was a small-scale horse trainer and farmer, a man with a deep understanding of the land and a fierce loyalty to his community. He was elected as the leader of his village's defense council, tasked with reclaiming the lands that had been illegally seized. This was not a revolutionary act at first, but a legal one. He tried to petition the government to use the existing laws to seek justice. But the legal system, like everything else under the Porfiriato, was stacked against the poor. The rich landowners had the power and the connections to manipulate the courts, and every attempt to reclaim the land through peaceful means was met with bureaucratic delay or outright rejection. This experience solidified Zapata's belief that the only way to achieve justice was through direct action. When Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosí, Zapata was one of the first to respond. He gathered a small band of followers, armed with little more than machetes and a few old rifles, and began his own rebellion. Unlike the large mobile armies of the North, Zapata's force, the Liberation Army of the South, was a guerrilla force deeply tied to the land. They knew every trail, every mountain pass, and every hiding place. They fought not for political power in far-off Mexico City, but for a simple and powerful principle, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. This was his cry, his vision, and it resonated profoundly with the impoverished peasants of the South. Zapata's movement was different in character from the Northern Revolution. While Pancho Villa's men were a mixture of cowboys, miners, and adventurers, Zapata's army was almost exclusively made up of indigenous peasants. Their goals were not grand or nationalistic. They were local and agrarian. They wanted to reclaim their ancestral lands, to dismantle the hacienda system, and to live in dignity on the soil they had worked for centuries. Zapata's fight was not for Madero or for the presidency, but for his people. This was a crucial distinction that would later lead to a great schism in the revolutionary ranks. The Liberation Army of the South was incredibly effective. They launched lightning raids on the sugar plantations, freeing the debt peons, seizing the land, and distributing it back to the peasants. They were an agrarian justice machine, a force for immediate, tangible change. The Federal Army, so used to conventional warfare, was completely outmatched by Zapata's guerrilla tactics. They would chase the Zapatistas into the hills, only to be ambushed and attacked from all sides. The Zapatistas were like the mist, appearing suddenly and then disappearing just as quickly into the dense vegetation of the Morelos countryside. The success of both the Northern and Southern revolutions, so different in their methods and their goals, was a testament to the widespread and varied discontent that Porfirio Díaz had allowed to fester for so long. The revolution was not a single, unified movement, but a collection of diverse struggles, each with its own leader, its own grievances, and its own vision for the future. The common thread was a desire for an end to the dictatorship, but beyond that, the goals were as varied as the people who fought for them. Historians still argue about the philosophical purity of the different revolutionary leaders. Was Villa a true revolutionary or just a glorified bandit? Was Zapata a narrow-minded regionalist or a visionary of social justice? The debate over their legacies is ongoing, but what is not in doubt is their effectiveness. Together, they applied pressure from two different ends of the nation, squeezing the Diaz regime until it could no longer hold. The news from the north and the south was a relentless stream of bad tidings for the old dictator. The northern armies were defeating his generals in open battle, and the southern forces were turning his most profitable region into a lawless wasteland. The myth of Porfirio Díaz's unshakable authority was gone. It had been replaced by the quiet but powerful reality of a nation in revolt. The year 1911 dawned with a sense of inevitability. The revolutionary forces, so recently a fragmented collection of guerrillas and rebels, were now a formidable presence on the Mexican landscape. The fall of Ciudad Juarez, a major border city, had been a catastrophic blow to the prestige and power of Porfirio Díaz. For the first time in over 3 decades, the dictator was not in complete control of his nation. The quiet confidence that had defined his rule had been replaced by a growing sense of panic, both in the government and among the wealthy elites who had so long supported him. The revolution was no longer a distant problem. It was at his doorstep. The capture of Juarez had been a kind of symbolic final straw. The city's surrender to the revolutionaries, led by the audacious Pancho Villa and the strategic Pascual Orozco, was an unmistakable signal that the tide had turned. The government's army, though better equipped on paper, was proving to be no match for the revolutionaries' morale, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and their relentless hit-and-run tactics. The federales were demoralized and stretched thin, unable to effectively contain the scattered uprisings that were now occurring in almost every state. The old order, built on a foundation of political control and military might, was simply not prepared for a true popular uprising. It was a classic case of an outdated system failing to adapt to a new kind of conflict. In the wake of this defeat, Madero, who was now operating from his temporary headquarters in Juarez, began to negotiate with representatives of the Díaz regime. The dictator, an old fox who had weathered many storms, knew when he was beaten. He could see the writing on the wall. The support from his key allies was eroding. The nation was in chaos, and the pressure from the United States, which had grown increasingly concerned about the instability on its border, was immense. The American government was not eager to intervene directly, but it was clear they were no longer willing to tolerate a long, drawn-out war. The diplomatic pressure was a powerful factor in pushing Díaz towards a peaceful, if humiliating, solution. On May 25, 1911, Porfirio Díaz, after more than 30 years in power, officially submitted his resignation. The event was both a moment of immense relief and a moment of profound uncertainty. The man who had been the face of Mexico for so long was stepping down, leaving a massive power vacuum in his wake. Díaz's resignation was not just a political act. It was the end of an era. His farewell address was a mix of self-justification and a warning to his successors. He said, with what historians still argue was either genuine foresight or a final act of hubris, that Madero had unleashed a force he could not control. He warned that the new leader would find himself in a far more difficult position, caught between the demands of the various revolutionary factions and the expectations of the nation. It was a parting shot, a final bit of gentle sarcasm from the old master of Mexican politics. Just a few days later, on May 31st, 1911, Porfirio Díaz and his family boarded the German steamer Ipiranga and set sail for Europe. an exile from the country he had so meticulously and at times brutally ruled. The scene was a subdued one, a far cry from the grand public ceremonies that had defined his career. He was leaving behind a nation he had both modernized and oppressed, a complex legacy that would be debated for decades to come. His departure marked the official end of the Porfiriato and the successful completion of the first phase of the revolution. The primary goal had been achieved. The dictator was gone. Madero, the gentle idealist, was now poised to take power. The revolutionary armies, which had fought so hard to remove Diaz, now looked to him to fulfill the promises he had made in the Plan of San Luis Potosí. But the revolution had been about more than just removing a single man. It was about land and liberty and justice and 100 other things that had been left unaddressed by the initial political goals of Madero. The different revolutionary factions, from the agrarian Zapatistas in the south to the pragmatic Villistas in the north, all had their own agendas. The common enemy was gone, and now the fragile alliance that had been formed was in danger of fracturing. The period immediately following Diaz's resignation was a moment of cautious optimism. The nation celebrated the end of the dictatorship, and Madero was welcomed with a hero's reception when he arrived in Mexico City. But the deeper, more complex problems that had fueled the revolution remained unsolved. The land question, the plight of the rural poor, and the desire for true political representation were all still on the table. The revolution had been a spectacular success in removing the old regime, but now it had to prove that it could build something new and better in its place. The real work, the hard work of governing a fractured and deeply divided nation, was about to begin. The calm after the storm was a fragile one, and the peace, as Diaz had so ominously predicted, would not last. With Porfirio Díaz's departure, Francisco Madero was hailed as the man of the hour. He was the provisional president, and soon after, in a seemingly free and fair election, he was elected president of Mexico with overwhelming support. The nation was filled with a sense of hope and relief. The long, stagnant reign of the dictator was over, and a new era of democracy and reform seemed to be at hand. Madero's entry into Mexico City was a triumphant procession. He was greeted by jubilant crowds who saw in him the embodiment of a new, peaceful future. But the reality of governing a fractured nation would prove far more challenging than overthrowing an old one. Madero, a man of profound principles, was a civilian at heart. He was an idealist who believed that the democratic process itself would be enough to solve Mexico's deep-seated problems. He set about creating a new government, but his approach was slow, cautious, and for many of his revolutionary allies, deeply frustrating. He appointed a cabinet that was a mix of old Porfirista politicians and new Maderista loyalists, a move he hoped would promote stability and unity. But instead, it created suspicion and resentment among the men who had fought and bled for the revolution. The generals who had won the war felt that they were being sidelined in favor of the very people they had just overthrown. It was a political tightrope walk, and Madero, for all his good intentions, was not a master acrobat. The most pressing issue, and the one that would ultimately unravel his presidency, was the land question. In the South, Emiliano Zapata and his liberation army had fought for Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. They had not taken up arms to install a new president. They had taken up arms to get their land back. Madero, however, believed that land reform should be a gradual process, one that would be worked out through legal means and commissions. He urged Zapata to disarm and wait for the government to address his grievances. But for Zapata, who had seen his community's lands seized through legal means under the old regime, this was a cruel and unacceptable answer. He had fought and won, and now he was being told to wait. Zapata's response was swift and resolute. He issued his own revolutionary plan, the Plan of Ayala, which was a direct and powerful challenge to Madero's authority. The Plan of Ayala denounced Madero as a traitor to the revolutionary cause, accused him of failing to deliver on the promise of land reform, and called for his removal from office. It declared Zapata as the true leader of the revolution and outlined a radical vision for agrarian reform, promising to seize the large haciendas and return the land to the peasants. It was a formal declaration of war against the man who was supposed to be his ally. The Plan of Ayala exposed the fundamental division within the revolutionary movement. The Maderista Revolution had been primarily a political one, focused on removing the dictator and establishing democracy. The Zapatista Revolution was a social one, focused on radical land redistribution and social justice. Madero, for all his progressive ideas, could not bridge this gap. His cautious, legalistic approach to land reform was simply too slow for a people who had been waiting for generations. He was a man of his time, an educated elite who believed in a system that had, for the rural poor, always been a tool of their oppression. In the North, similar problems began to emerge. Pascual Orozco, the brilliant military commander who had won the battles that toppled Diaz, felt that he had not been given the credit or the power he deserved. He was a man of action, and Madero's slow-moving bureaucracy was a source of constant frustration. He, too, felt that the revolution had been betrayed, that the promises made to the working class and the soldiers had been forgotten. In a move that shocked the nation, Orozco also turned against Madero and launched his own rebellion. This created a new three-way civil war, with Madero's government caught between the forces of Zapata in the south and Orozco in the north. Madero's presidency was also plagued by a series of smaller, but no less significant, rebellions from various disaffected groups. His failure to satisfy the demands of his more radical allies was a constant source of instability. The military, which he had unwisely kept largely intact from the Porfiriato, was also a source of deep-seated resentment. The old generals, loyal to the old regime, saw him as a weak, ineffectual leader, and they harbored a deep-seated contempt for the amateur politician who had so improbably taken power. Madero, for all his popularity, was losing control of his nation. His gentle approach to governance, so effective in toppling a dictator, was proving to be a liability in the brutal and unforgiving world of revolutionary politics. It's like bringing a pillow fight to a boxing match. The intentions are good, but the results are predictable. The delicate political balance that Francisco Madero had tried so hard to maintain was beginning to unravel in spectacular fashion. The quiet discontent that had simmered just beneath the surface of his presidency now exploded into open rebellion. Pascual Orozco, The brilliant military commander from the north, who had felt betrayed by Madero's cautious reforms, launched a full-scale revolt. His rebellion, known as the Orozquista Rebellion, was a powerful and immediate threat to the Madero government. Orozco was a man of action, and he had the loyalty of many of the northern troops who felt that their sacrifices had been for nothing. They had fought to end injustice, not to replace one elite with another. Orozco's Plan of Orozco was a powerful document that directly challenged the Maderista vision. It was a more radical manifesto, calling for significant labor reforms, an 8-hour workday, restrictions on child labor, and, most importantly, the nationalization of the railroads. It was a political platform that resonated deeply with the workers and the more radical elements of the revolution. Orozco was, in a sense, trying to finish the social revolution that Madero had left half-finished. He was a populist leader, and his message was simple. Madero had betrayed the very people who had put him in power. The Madero government, caught between the Zapatistas in the south and the Orozquistas in the north, was forced to act. Madero, ever the idealist, still believed in a political solution, but the crisis demanded a military one. He turned to his minister of war, a man named Victoriano Huerta, to lead the federal army against the rebels. Huerta was a professional soldier, a veteran of the Díaz regime, a man of ruthless efficiency and a reputation for cold, calculating pragmatism. He was, in many ways, the opposite of Madero. His appointment was a controversial one, a pragmatic choice that would have tragic consequences. Historians still argue whether Madero had a choice. Some say he was forced into a corner, with no one else able to command the loyalty of the old military. Others contend it was a fatal miscalculation, a failure to understand the true character of the man he was putting his trust in. Huerta, with his professional army, was remarkably successful in his campaign against Orozco. He pushed the Orozquista forces back and inflicted a series of crushing defeats. His military victories were a source of great relief for the Madero government, but they also cemented Huerta's position as the most powerful military figure in the country. He was the only one, it seemed, who could bring a sense of order to the chaos. But as he crushed the Orozco rebellion, his ambition grew. He saw Madero as a weak, ineffectual leader, a man who was incapable of bringing lasting peace to the nation. He saw an opportunity to seize power for himself. Meanwhile, Francisco Pancho Villa, the flamboyant and charismatic general from the north, remained loyal to Madero. He fought alongside Huerta against the Orozquistas, but their relationship was strained. Huerta, the professional soldier, looked down on the former bandit, and Villa, with his deep sense of loyalty and his fierce pride, resented the general's cold and condescending manner. The tension between them was palpable. In one instance, a minor dispute between the two men almost erupted into a gunfight. It was a clear signal of the deep-seated divisions that still ran through the revolutionary ranks, even among those who were fighting on the same side. Madero's presidency was a brief and turbulent interlude. He had achieved the impossible. He had toppled a dictator and established a new, democratic government. But he had failed to address the deeper, more complex issues of land reform and social justice that had fueled the revolution in the first place. His cautious approach had alienated his most powerful allies and had failed to win over his most powerful enemies. He was a man with a vision of a peaceful, democratic Mexico, but he was living in a nation that was still ruled by the law of the gun. His political reforms, though well-intentioned, were no match for the deep-seated grievances of the people or the ruthless ambitions of the men who surrounded him. The Orozco Rebellion was a dress rehearsal for Madero's downfall. It exposed the fragility of his government, his reliance on a military that was not truly loyal to him, and the deep divisions within the revolutionary movement. The stage was set for the final, tragic act of his presidency. The men he had trusted to save him were the very men who would ultimately betray him. The quiet, hopeful days of his triumph were long gone, replaced by a new, more dangerous political reality. The revolution had entered a new, more brutal phase, a civil war within a civil war, and its next victim would be the man who had started it all. The year was 1913, and the calm that had so briefly settled over Mexico City was about to be shattered. The political factions that had been circling Francisco Madero's presidency finally made their move, and the result was one of the most tragic and pivotal events of the entire revolution, the 10 Tragic Days, or La Decena Trágica. The name itself, coined by the Mexican historian Luis Cabrera, speaks to the profound sorrow and chaos that defined this period. It was a 10-day military coup d'etat that began on February 9th and ended with the betrayal and assassination of the man who had started it all. It was a brutal act that would forever change the course of Mexican history. The plot was orchestrated by a group of conservative generals and old Porfirista politicians who were deeply resentful of Madero's reforms and his gentle, almost naive approach to power. The key players were General Felix Diaz, the nephew of the former dictator, and General Bernardo Reyes, a powerful former general who had been imprisoned by Madero. The conspirators, with the quiet support of the American ambassador at the time, Henry Lane Wilson, saw an opportunity to restore the old order. They believed Madero was a weak leader who was unable to control the country, and they were convinced that only a return to a strong military government could restore stability. The coup began with a coordinated attack on 2 key locations in Mexico City, the National Palace and the presidential residence. The rebels, led by Reyes and Diaz, marched through the streets, seizing control of strategic points and engaging in fierce firefights with the loyalist forces. The sounds of gunfire and the sight of smoke rising from the city's center were a shocking and terrifying experience for the residents. For 10 long days, Mexico City was a battlefield. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with civilians caught in the crossfire. It was a complete breakdown of law and order, a descent into chaos that seemed to confirm the worst fears of Madero's critics. The battle lines were not clear-cut. Generals and units shifted their allegiances, and the confusion was absolute. But the most insidious part of the plot was happening behind the scenes. Madero, ever the trusting idealist, had once again made a fatal miscalculation. He had entrusted the defense of the capital to his most powerful general, Victoriano Huerta, the very man who had so successfully defeated the Orozco Rebellion. But Huerta was a man of cold ambition. He saw the chaos in the city not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be seized. While Madero believed Huerta was fighting to save his government, Huerta was secretly negotiating with the conspirators. He was playing both sides against the middle, a master of deception and intrigue. On February 18, 1913, Huerta's betrayal became complete. He orchestrated a meeting with Madero and his vice president, Pino Suarez, under the guise of discussing the military situation. Once inside, Madero and Suarez were arrested by Huerta's forces. The coup was complete. The democratic government, so recently and triumphantly established, was now a thing of the past. The 10 tragic days had ended not with a victory for either side, but with the quiet, chilling success of a third party. The final act of this tragedy was the most brutal. On the night of February 22nd, 1913, Francisco Madero and Pino Suarez were being transferred from the National Palace to a prison. Their car was stopped, and they were taken to a deserted spot near the Lecumberri prison. Under the cover of darkness, both men were executed. The official story that they had been killed in an escape attempt was a transparent lie that fooled no one. The assassination sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. It was a moral crime of the highest order, a betrayal of the democratic ideals that Madero had fought so hard to instill. It was the moment the revolution lost its innocence. Historians still argue about the precise role of the U.S. ambassador in the events. It is a mainstream historical fact that Henry Lane Wilson was a vocal critic of Madero, whom he considered too weak to govern, and he met with Huerta and the conspirators several times during the 10 tragic days. This involvement, whether direct or indirect, would lead to years of strained relations between the United States and Mexico. The death of Madero, the gentle idealist, was a symbolic turning point. The revolution had started as a movement for democracy and political reform, but in the crucible of La Decena Tragica, it was revealed for what it truly was: a brutal and unforgiving struggle for power. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one that would be far more violent and far more complex than the one that had just ended. The dust had barely settled in Mexico City when Victoriano Huerta seized control of the government. In the bloody aftermath of the 10 tragic days and the assassination of Francisco Madero, the nation was thrown into a new kind of crisis. Huerta, a man whose ruthlessness had been masked by his military efficiency, now emerged as the new dictator. He was a professional soldier with a reputation for a grim, uncompromising demeanor, often seen with a dark pair of glasses and a cold, calculating stare. He was the antithesis of the gentle idealist he had just betrayed. His rise to power marked a profound shift in the nature of the revolution, from a struggle for democracy to a brutal and unforgiving contest for control of the state. Huerta's regime was, from the very beginning, a military dictatorship in all but name. He dissolved the Congress, imprisoned political opponents, and established a system of rule based on force and coercion. He was a man who believed that Mexico could only be governed through an iron fist, and he set about implementing his vision with a chilling efficiency. His supporters were the old Porfirista elite, the wealthy landowners, and the military establishment who yearned for a return to the order and progress of the past. They saw in Huerta a man who could bring stability, even if it meant sacrificing the democratic ideals that Madero had so recently championed. Huerta was, in a sense, a throwback to the old days, a ghost of the Porfiriato that had just been overthrown. But in his ruthless grab for power, Huerta had managed to do something that Madero, with all his good intentions, had failed to do. He united the disparate revolutionary factions against him. The assassination of Madero was a moral crime that transcended political and ideological differences. For Pancho Villa in the north, Madero's death was a personal betrayal. He had been loyal to the president, and he now felt a burning desire for revenge against the man who had murdered him. For Emiliano Zapata in the south, the death of Madero, who he had so recently rebelled against, was a signal that the revolution itself was in a mortal danger. He saw Huerta's regime as a return to the kind of oppression that had fueled his movement from the very beginning. The Zapatistas and the Villistas, though still wary of each other, now had a common enemy, a monster to fight against. A new leader emerged from the northern state of Coahuila to give a voice and a purpose to this renewed opposition. His name was Venustiano Carranza, the governor of the state and a former supporter of Madero. Carranza was a man of immense dignity and gravitas, a figure who looked like a president. He was a constitutionalist at heart, a lawyer and a politician who believed in the rule of law. He rejected Huerta's presidency as illegitimate and declared himself the leader of a new revolutionary movement, the Constitutionalist Army. His plan, the Plan of Guadalupe, was a simple and direct call to arms. It refused to recognize Huerta's government and called for the formation of a new provisional government that would restore the constitutional order. Carranza's plan was not about social reform or land redistribution. It was a political statement, a declaration that the rule of law must prevail over the rule of force. The revolution had now entered a new and far more brutal phase. The unified opposition to Huerta was composed of three main factions: the Constitutionalist Army in the north, led by Carranza and his brilliant young general Álvaro Obregón; the Northern Division, led by the indomitable Pancho Villa; and the Liberation Army of the South, led by the steadfast Emiliano Zapata. They were an unlikely alliance, a collection of men with vastly different backgrounds, goals, and visions for the future of Mexico. Carranza was a conservative politician, a man of law and order. Villas was a charismatic populist and a brilliant military commander with a fierce sense of social justice. And Zapata was a dedicated agrarian who only cared about one thing: getting the land back for his people. It was an alliance born not of shared values, but of a shared enemy. It was, in a sense, a marriage of convenience, and everyone knew that once the common enemy was gone, the real fight would begin. Huerta's regime, for all its ruthless efficiency, was a pariah on the world stage. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, refused to recognize his government, an act that was both a moral condemnation of the assassination and a strategic move to undermine the new dictator. The lack of international support, combined with the relentless pressure from the United Revolutionary Armies, meant that Huerta's time in power was always going to be a difficult one. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, with his enemies closing in on all sides. The revolution had found its new focus, its new purpose, It was no longer about a peaceful transition to democracy. It was about destroying a man and the brutal system he represented. As the Constitutionalist army, united in their opposition to Victoriano Huerta, began to gather momentum, a new military powerhouse emerged from the arid plains of northern Mexico. This was the legendary División del Norte, or Northern Division, led by the enigmatic and brilliant Pancho Villa. Villa's division was not a conventional army. It was a force forged from the dust and sweat of the borderlands, composed of cowboys, vaqueros, ranchers, and impoverished peasants who saw in him not just a general, but a true leader of the people. His military prowess was astounding, a kind of intuitive genius for tactics and strategy that defied all conventional military training. He was a master of mobile warfare, using the wide-open spaces of the North to his advantage, launching lightning-fast cavalry charges that broke the will and the lines of the federal troops. The División del Norte was more than just a fighting force. It was a self-contained mobile state. Villa, in his charismatic and often ruthless way, ensured his troops were well-fed, well-armed, and most importantly, paid. He did this by a variety of means, some of them a little less than legal. He would seize cattle from the large haciendas, sell them to American buyers across the border, and use the money to fund his army. He took control of the railroads in his territory, seizing and operating them to move his troops and supplies. He even had his own currency printed, the famous Villa bills, which his soldiers were paid in and which were accepted in the towns he liberated. He was running a military economic machine that was a testament to his resourcefulness and his complete disregard for the old rules. It's a bit like a military CEO who also happens to be a fantastic cowboy. The Northern Division became the most powerful single fighting force in the Revolution. They captured key cities like Ciudad Chihuahua, Zacatecas, and Torreón, winning a series of stunning victories that made headlines around the world. Villa's fame grew to mythic proportions, and his exploits were celebrated in folk songs and newspapers across the globe. He was seen as the heart and soul of the rebellion, a man who fought not for personal glory, but for the people he represented. His victories were a source of immense pride for the Constitutionalist cause, and they were a constant source of fear and frustration for the Huerta regime. The federal army simply could not contain him, while the Constitutionalist movement was united in its goal to defeat Huerta. The divisions among the leaders were already starting to show. Villa, for all his military genius, was not a politician. He was a man of action, a man who believed that the best way to solve a problem was to ride into it and shoot. His relationship with Venustiano Carranza, the dignified and formal leader of the movement, was a source of constant friction. Carranza was a man of law and order, a lawyer who believed in the primacy of the Constitution. He saw Villa as a valuable but unpredictable general, a kind of necessary evil who was too wild to be trusted with true political power. The two men were a study in contrasts. Carranza, with his meticulous plans and his formal address, and Villa, with his gut instincts and his fiery, unpredictable temper. It was a partnership that was destined to fail once the common enemy was gone. The role of the United States in the Revolution also began to take on new importance during this period. The American government under President Woodrow Wilson was deeply opposed to Huerta, whom they saw as a murderer and a usurper. They provided a steady stream of moral and logistical support to the Constitutionalists, allowing them to buy weapons and supplies across the border. This support was crucial to the success of the revolution, particularly for the Northern Division, which relied heavily on the American armaments to fuel its military machine. Historians still argue whether the American government fully understood the man they were supporting. Some say they were happy to support a known quantity like Carranza and simply tolerated Villa. Others contend that they were so desperate to see Huerta gone that they were willing to work with anyone who could get the job done. The rise of the División del Norte was a turning point in the revolution. It was the moment that the anti-Huerta forces gained a decisive military advantage. Villa's victories were not just military, they were psychological. They broke the will of the Federal Army and showed the Mexican people that the dictator could be defeated. The battle for Mexico City was now a foregone conclusion. The only question was who would get there first and who would be left standing when the dust settled. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, a civil war within a civil war, a brutal and unforgiving struggle for the future of Mexico. As Pancho Villa's División del Norte steamrolled through the north, winning one spectacular victory after another, the political maneuvering of Venustiano Carranza became ever more significant. While Villa was a man of action, Carranza was a man of policy and a skilled political operator. He was the first chief of the Constitutionalist Army, a title that reflected his belief that the revolution was fundamentally about restoring constitutional order, not about radical social change. Carranza understood that the war against Huerta was not just a military conflict, it was a political one, and the support of key states and international powers was just as important as winning battles. Carranza's power base was in the northern states, particularly his home state of Coahuila, where he had been governor. He had a meticulous approach to governance and a deep respect for the law. He established a shadow government in his revolutionary capital, first in Sonora and later in Veracruz, and began to lay the groundwork for a new, post-Huerta Mexico. He issued decrees, appointed officials, and conducted foreign policy, all while the fighting was still raging. It was a clear signal that he saw himself as the only legitimate successor to Madero and the true leader of the revolution. His most crucial political task was managing the complex relationship with the United States. President Woodrow Wilson's administration had refused to recognize Huerta's regime, but they were wary of supporting the more radical elements of the revolution. Carranza, with his formal demeanor and his legalistic approach, was a reassuring figure to the Americans. He was a known quantity, a man who seemed to represent a return to stability and order. Carranza cleverly played on these perceptions, portraying himself as the only man who could restore peace and protect American business interests in Mexico. He was careful to maintain a sense of Mexican sovereignty, however, and he often pushed back against American attempts to intervene directly in Mexican affairs. It was a delicate dance, and Carranza proved to be a master of it. While Villa was fighting his battles, Carranza was building his army. He appointed a brilliant young general named Álvaro Obregón to lead the Constitutionalist forces in the West. Obregón was a pragmatic and intelligent military commander, a man who believed in modern warfare and who quickly adapted to the complexities of the revolution. He was a contrast to both Carranza's political maneuvering and Vila's wild cavalier style. Obregón was a tactician, a man who relied on modern technology and careful planning to win his battles. He was also fiercely loyal to Carranza, a loyalty that would serve him well in the years to come. The relationship between the three main leaders, Carranza, Vila, and Zapata, was a complex and constantly shifting one. They were united by their shared enemy, but their visions for the future of Mexico were vastly different. Carranza saw the revolution as a political struggle to restore the Constitution and bring back the rule of law. Vila saw it as a social struggle to give the poor a voice and a chance at a better life. And Zapata, remember, saw it as a singular fight for land. This fundamental ideological schism was a quiet, constant presence in the background of the war. They were like three friends trying to build a house, but each one had a different blueprint, and no one was talking about it. Huerta's military position was deteriorating rapidly. The combined forces of the Constitutionalists were too powerful, and his government was collapsing from within. He was running out of money, his army was demoralized, and he had no international support. The fall of Mexico City was now a foregone conclusion. The only question was who would be the one to claim it. Vila, with his legendary army, was the obvious choice, but Carranza, with his careful planning and his political acumen, had other ideas. He wanted to ensure that the military victories were not just a prelude to a new dictatorship, and he was determined to be the one who controlled the political outcome. In July 1914, Victoriano Huerta, a man who had ruled for just over a year, resigned and went into exile. The end of his reign was met with a mix of relief and renewed uncertainty. The dictator was gone, but the fundamental ideological divisions among the revolutionaries were still present. The alliance that had been so effective in fighting Huerta was about to face its ultimate test. With the common enemy gone, the three leaders, Carranza, Vila, and Zapata, would now have to decide the future of Mexico, and their conflicting visions would lead to the most violent and destructive phase of the revolution yet. With Victoriano Huerta's resignation in July 1914, the first great war of the revolution came to a close, but the peace that followed was an illusion. The fragile alliance that had united Carranza, Vila, and Zapata against their common enemy now dissolved into a three-way struggle for control of the nation. The ideological and personal differences that had been simmering beneath the surface now came to a full boil, leading to a new and even more brutal phase of the conflict. The central question was no longer how to overthrow a dictator, but who would lead the country, and what kind of country would it be? Venustiano Carranza, with his political and legalistic mind, saw himself as the natural heir to Madero. He had been the first chief of the Constitutionalist army, the man who had given the revolution its legal and political legitimacy. He believed that his authority was a matter of principle and that he should be the one to preside over the transition to a new government. He entered Mexico City triumphantly. His formal demeanor and his meticulously planned political moves a stark contrast to the wild energy of the revolution he had just led. He was a man who believed in the power of institutions and the rule of law, and he was determined to establish a government that was a return to constitutional order, not a radical social experiment. But Pancho Villa saw things very differently. He was the military hero of the revolution, the man who had won the battles that had toppled Huerta. His army, the División del Norte, was the most powerful fighting force in the country, and he believed that his victories entitled him to a major say in the future of Mexico. Villas was a populist at heart, a man who believed that the revolution was for the poor and the dispossessed, and he harbored a deep suspicion of Carranza and his more conservative political allies. He saw Carranza as a man who would betray the promises of the revolution, a return to the kind of corrupt, elite-dominated government that had led to the conflict in the first place. Emiliano Zapata, in his southern stronghold, was even more removed from the political machinations of the North. His concerns were singular and unyielding: land reform. He had fought not for a new president or a new constitution, but for the return of his people's lands. He saw Carranza as just another politician who would make promises and then fail to deliver. His motto, Tierra y Libertad, was not a negotiating point. It was an absolute demand. He refused to recognize Carranza's authority and continued his armed struggle, convinced that the only way to achieve true justice was to take the land back by force. It's a bit like a group project, where one person just wants to do the work, one wants to write a detailed plan, and the third just wants to get a good grade, and no one can agree on the best way forward. To address the growing tensions, Carranza convened a great revolutionary convention in Aguascalientes. The goal was to bring all the revolutionary leaders together to determine the future of the nation, to create a plan for a new government, and to find a way to unify the disparate factions. But the convention quickly devolved into a series of bitter arguments and political maneuvering. The delegates from Carranza and Villa clashed repeatedly. Villa's representatives demanded that Carranza step down and that a new, more radical government be formed. Carranza's allies, in turn, accused Villa of being a power-hungry bandit who was unfit to lead. The Convention of Aguascalientes, instead of uniting the revolution, ended up formalizing the split. The delegates, siding with Villa and Zapata, declared Carranza illegitimate and elected their own provisional president, Eulalio Gutierrez. Carranza, for his part, refused to recognize the convention's authority and moved his government to Veracruz, declaring his continued legitimacy as the first chief. The revolution had officially fractured into two main camps: the Conventionists, led by Villa and Zapata, and the Constitutionalists, led by Carranza and his brilliant general, Álvaro Obregón. The war for the soul of Mexico was about to begin. The country was about to be plunged into its most violent and destructive phase, a civil war where there were no clear heroes or villains, only a tragic and brutal struggle for power. The split at the Convention of Aguascalientes was not just a political disagreement. It was a prelude to a new and devastating civil war. The revolution had gone from fighting against a common enemy to fighting against itself. The two factions, the Constitutionalists, led by Venustiano Carranza, and the Conventionists, led by the powerful duo of Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, now prepared for a final, all-out struggle for the future of Mexico. This was the most violent and destructive phase of the entire conflict, a time of massive battles and shifting allegiances. Carranza, ever the pragmatist, understood that while he had the legal and political legitimacy, Villa had the military might. His strategy was to avoid a direct confrontation with Villa's massive army and to use his most brilliant general, Álvaro Obregón, to outmaneuver him. Obregón was a modern military man, a student of tactics and technology, and he knew that Villa's reliance on the cavalry charge was his greatest strength, but also his greatest weakness. Obregón had a deep respect for Villa's abilities, but he also understood that the age of the cavalry was coming to an end. He was a master of defensive warfare, and he would use the new technology of machine guns and barbed wire to nullify Villa's greatest military asset. The Villistas and Zapatistas, the two pillars of the conventionist cause, were a formidable force on paper. In December 1914, Villa and Zapata, the two most iconic figures of the revolution, met for the first time in Mexico City. The famous photograph of the two men sitting in the presidential chair at the National Palace is a powerful and enduring image. It was a symbolic moment of revolutionary unity, a brief glimpse of what a truly unified, popular revolution might look like. But their alliance was fragile. They were men from two different worlds, with two different sets of goals. Zapata, a man of the land, was deeply uncomfortable in the capital and left after only a few weeks, returning to his southern stronghold to continue his fight for land reform. Villa and his men, in their element in the north, were now occupying a city they didn't fully understand, and their attempts to govern were a disorganized and often brutal affair. The alliance, for all its symbolic power, was not a practical military or political partnership. The decisive battles of this phase of the war were fought in the north, where Obregón and Villa clashed in a series of epic confrontations. The most significant of these was the Battle of Celaya in April 1915. It was a massive, week-long battle that pitted Villa's legendary cavalry against Obregón's modern, entrenched defenses. Obregón's strategy was simple but effective. He used machine guns, barbed wire, and deep trenches to turn the battlefield into a killing field. Villa, who had always relied on the sheer force and speed of his cavalry charges, found his army repeatedly cut to pieces. The battle was a crushing defeat for Villa and a brilliant victory for Obregón. The Battle of Celaya was not just a military defeat for the División del Norte. It was a psychological one. It proved that Villa was not invincible and that his tactics were no longer effective against a modern, well-prepared army. The defeat at Celaya was the beginning of the end for the conventionists. Obregón's forces continued to pursue Villa, inflicting a series of follow-up defeats that decimated his army and forced him to retreat north. Meanwhile, Carranza's constitutionalist government, now secure in its control of Mexico City and the central states, began to consolidate its power. They were the ones who had a clear political agenda, and they were the ones who were winning the war. The great alliance of Villa and Zapata, so powerful in its symbolism, had failed in practice. They were, in the end, two generals without a unified political vision. They had won the war against Huerta, but they had lost the war for the future of the nation. The year 1915 marked the beginning of the end for the great revolutionary duo of Villa and Zapata. With Pancho Villa's crushing defeat at the Battle of Celaya, his once invincible División del Norte was in a state of terminal decline. The brilliant tactical mind of Álvaro Obregón, Carranza's most trusted general, had proven that the old ways of war, the sweeping cavalry charges, and the brute force of a massive army were no match for modern defensive technology. Obregón's use of trenches, barbed wire, and most importantly machine guns had decimated Villa's forces and broken the spirit of his men. The romantic era of the revolutionary hero on horseback was now a relic of the past, replaced by the grim and mechanical reality of industrial warfare. It was a kind of a sad and anticlimactic end to the legend of the División del Norte. Villa, a man who had never known defeat on this scale, was a broken man. He was forced to retreat further and further north, his army a shadow of its former self. He continued to fight, of course, a kind of desperate last-ditch effort to keep the revolution alive. He launched a series of guerrilla raids and minor battles, but they were no longer a threat to the established order. His political influence was gone, and his military power was a thing of the past. The charismatic leader who had once been the toast of the nation was now a fugitive, a kind of ghost haunting the deserts of Chihuahua. His soldiers, once so loyal, began to desert in droves, and the political establishment, seeing the writing on the wall, began to abandon him. Meanwhile, Venustiano Carranza, with Obregón's victories in the north, began to consolidate his power. The Constitutionalist army was now the dominant military force in the nation, and Carranza's government, based in Veracruz, was the only one with any claim to legitimacy. He was recognized by the United States government as the de facto leader of Mexico, a crucial diplomatic victory that cemented his position as the man in charge. The United States, which had long been wary of the chaos in Mexico, saw Carranza as the only one who could bring stability and an order. The recognition was a powerful signal to all the remaining factions that the war was over and the Constitutionalists had won. The alliance of Villa and Zapata, which had been so powerful in its symbolism, was now completely broken. They were two leaders who had never fully trusted each other, and with the pressure of war and defeat, the fissures that had always been present now became a gaping chasm. Zapata remained in his southern stronghold, a kind of regional king who was fighting his own private war. He was still a threat, of course, but he was isolated, and his movement, for all its ideological purity, could not hope to defeat the national government. Villa, for his part, was reduced to a regional warlord, a bandit who was now being hunted by both the Carranchistas and the Americans. The downfall of Pancho Villa was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. It was a sign that the revolution, for all its wild energy and its populist heroes, was now in the hands of the more pragmatic and professional leaders. The era of the bandit-turned-general was over. The future of Mexico was now in the hands of men like Carranza and Obregón, men who were more interested in building a new state than in fighting a bloody, endless war. It was a victory for the legalists over the idealists, for the politicians over the populists. It was, in a sense, a victory for a more orderly and perhaps less romantic version of the revolution. Historians still argue about the true nature of Vila's legacy. Was he a true revolutionary hero, a champion of the people who was betrayed by the political establishment? Or was he a glorified bandit who was simply a product of the chaos of the revolution? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is probably a bit of both. He was a man of immense contradictions, a brutal and violent man who was also capable of great loyalty and generosity. He was a product of his time, a figure who could only have emerged from the unique circumstances of the Mexican Revolution. And his downfall, for all its tragedy, was a sign that the revolution was entering a new and perhaps more stable phase. The war for the future of Mexico was not over, but the final players had now been decided. The year 1916 was a period of consolidation for Venustiano Carranza, but it was also a year of new and unforeseen challenges, particularly from an old foe. With his government recognized by the United States and his main military rival, Pancho Villa, in retreat, Carranza was beginning to feel secure in his position. But Villa was not a man to go down quietly. Desperate for money and supplies, and feeling betrayed by the American government's recognition of Carranza, he launched a raid that would forever alter the course of the revolution and the relationship between Mexico and the United States. On the morning of March 9th, 1916, Pancho Villa and his men, a force of several hundred revolutionaries, crossed the border into the United States and attacked the small border town of Columbus, New Mexico. The raid was a chaotic and brutal affair. The Villistas looted the town, stole horses and supplies, and engaged in a fierce firefight with a small detachment of U.S. soldiers. The raid was a bold and audacious act, a kind of middle finger to the American government that had so recently abandoned him. For Villa, it was a way to replenish his dwindling supplies and a way to prove that he was still a force to be reckoned with. For the Americans, it was an unforgivable act of aggression, a violation of their sovereignty that demanded a swift and decisive response. The American public was outraged, and President Woodrow Wilson, under immense political pressure, ordered the U.S. Army to pursue Villa into Mexico. This was the start of the Punitive Expedition, a massive military operation led by General John J. Blackjack Pershing. The expedition, a force of over 10,000 American soldiers, was tasked with a singular mission: to capture Pancho Villa, dead or alive. The invasion was a clear violation of Mexican sovereignty, and it was met with widespread resentment and anger from the Mexican people and the Carranza government. The punitive expedition, for all its might, was a complete failure. Villa, a master of the terrain and a brilliant guerrilla fighter, was a phantom. His knowledge of the vast, rugged deserts of Chihuahua was far superior to that of the American soldiers. He would ambush their supply lines, attack their outposts, and then disappear back into the mountains. The American Army, with all its modern technology and its professional training, was unable to catch a single man. The chase lasted for nearly a year, and it was a source of great frustration for the American government and a source of great pride for the Mexican people, who saw Villa as a kind of national hero who had stood up to the mighty gringos. While the punitive expedition was a military failure, it had a profound political impact. It infuriated Carranza, who saw the American presence on Mexican soil as a direct threat to his authority. He ordered his army to resist the American advance, and there were several minor but tense clashes between American and Mexican troops. The U.S. invasion, far from uniting the Mexican people behind Carranza, only deepened their suspicion of American motives. It was a clear demonstration that the United States would not hesitate to violate Mexico's sovereignty when its own interests were threatened. Historians still debate the true motivation behind Villa's raid. Some argue it was a desperate, last-ditch effort to keep his rebellion alive. Others contend it was a calculated risk, a way to provoke a military response from the United States that would humiliate Carranza and force the Americans to reconsider their support for his government. Whatever the reason, the raid had the unintended consequence of turning Villa from a defeated warlord into a kind of folk hero, a man who had stood up to the Colossus to the north. It cemented his place in Mexican history as a symbol of defiance and a champion of national pride. The punitive expedition, for all its sound and fury, accomplished nothing. It only proved that in the vast, unforgiving deserts of Mexico, a well-armed and determined guerrilla fighter was more than a match for the most powerful army in the world. The Americans, for their part, would eventually withdraw, humiliated and empty-handed, leaving Carranza to deal with the lingering resentment and the still unsolved problem of Pancho Villa. While the northern states were a battlefield of massive armies and international entanglements, a different kind of war was being waged in the southern state of Morelos. Here, the struggle was not for political power or national control, but for the fundamental right to own the land one worked. The leader of this agrarian revolution was Emiliano Zapata. For him, the fight was personal and deeply rooted in the history of his people. His army, the Liberation Army of the South, was a guerrilla force made up of indigenous peasants who had lost their ancestral lands to the vast and powerful sugar plantations of the Porfiriato. Zapata's movement was singular and unyielding, a force driven by a simple and powerful ideal: Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. The Zapatistas had, from the very beginning, been at odds with the other revolutionary factions. They had rebelled against Madero when he failed to deliver on the promise of land reform, and they had been a constant thorn in the side of Venustiano Carranza and his Constitutionalists, whom they saw as nothing more than a new political elite. Zapata's vision was not a new constitution or a new president, but a radical and immediate redistribution of land. He and his men would raid the large haciendas, burn the sugarcane fields, and seize the land, distributing it back to the local communities. They were a force of agrarian justice, a kind of roving land reform committee with guns. Zapata's movement was an anomaly in the revolution. While the northern generals, like Pancho Villa and Álvaro Obregón, were fighting massive conventional battles, Zapata was engaged in a more intimate and brutal kind of warfare. He was a master of guerrilla tactics, using his deep knowledge of the rugged terrain of Morelos to his advantage. His army was like the landscape itself, a wild and unpredictable force that could appear out of nowhere and then vanish just as quickly. The federal troops, and later the Constitutionalist forces, found it nearly impossible to defeat him. They could occupy the cities, but they could not control the countryside, where the hearts and minds of the people were with Zapata. The Zapatistas also had a clear and uncompromising political platform, the Plan of Ayala. Remember, this was the document that had denounced Madero and called for radical land reform. It was a simple yet powerful manifesto that became the guiding principle of the Southern Revolution. It was not a blueprint for a national government, but a promise of a new kind of society, one where the land belonged to the people who worked it. Zapata was not interested in political compromise. He had been betrayed too many times, and he believed that the only way to achieve his goals was to continue fighting until his vision was a reality. The Southern Revolution, for all its ideological purity, was also a source of great frustration for Carranza's government. They saw Zapata as a bandit, a regional strongman who was unwilling to cooperate in the project of building a new, modern state. The constant conflict in the South was a drain on their resources and a source of political instability. They tried to defeat him militarily, of course, but their campaigns were always unsuccessful. Zapata was too clever, and his men were too loyal to be defeated in a conventional war. He was a master of the hit and run, a kind of ghost in the mountains who was always one step ahead of his enemies. Historians still argue about whether Zapata's movement was a viable path for the future of Mexico. Some see him as a narrow-minded regionalist, a man whose focus on land reform was too limited to be a national solution. Others see him as a true visionary, a champion of the poor and the marginalized, whose vision of agrarian justice was the true heart of the revolution. The truth, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a man with a singular focus, a man who refused to compromise his ideals for the sake of political expediency. And in a revolution that was filled with men who were willing to betray their principles for power, Zapata's unyielding integrity made him a legend. The Southern Revolution would continue long after the Northern armies had been defeated, a quiet and stubborn testament to the fact that for many Mexicans, the struggle for land and liberty was a war that had not yet been won. With Victoriano Huerta's dictatorship in the past, and the punitive expedition a humiliating memory for the Americans, Venustiano Carranza had by 1916 solidified his position as the dominant political force in Mexico. He was the first chief of the Constitutionalist army, the de facto president, and the man who had brought a measure of stability back to the nation. But Carranza was a man who believed in the rule of law, and he understood that his power, though won by force of arms, needed to be legitimized by a new constitution. The old 1857 Constitution had been a good document, but the revolution had exposed its limitations. The nation was in dire need of a new social contract, a document that would not only restore the rule of law, but also address the deep-seated grievances of the people. And so, in December of 1916, Carranza convened a constitutional convention in the central city of Querétaro. The delegates to the convention were not a mix of old Porfiristas and new revolutionaries. They were, for the most part, loyal Constitutionalists who had fought in the war. The convention was dominated by two factions: the moderates, who were loyal to Carranza and who wanted a document that was a return to the political principles of Francisco Madero, and the radicals, who were led by a group of intellectuals and military men who wanted a document that would enshrine the social and economic promises of the revolution. It was a fascinating and intense debate, a clash of two very different visions for the future of Mexico. Carranza, in his draft of the new Constitution, had proposed a document that was, for the most part, a return to the 1857 Constitution with a few minor additions. He believed that the primary goal of the revolution had been to restore political order, and he was wary of the more radical demands of the peasants and the workers. But the radicals at the convention had other ideas. They had fought and bled for a new kind of Mexico, and they were determined to create a document that would reflect the social and economic realities of the nation. They had seen the poverty of the countryside and the injustice of the factories, and they were not going to let a return to the status quo happen. The most heated debates at the convention were about three key issues: land, labor, and the church. The radicals, led by men like General Francisco Mujica, argued for a constitution that would enshrine the rights of the workers and the peasants. They argued that land reform was not just a matter of justice, but a matter of national security. They wanted a constitution that would break up the giant haciendas and return the land to the people who worked it. They also argued for a constitution that would protect the rights of labor, giving workers the right to organize, to strike, and to an 8-hour workday. They wanted a constitution that would finally put an end to the brutal conditions of the Porfiriato. And on the issue of the church, the debate was just as fierce. The radicals were deeply anti-clerical. They believed that the Catholic Church, which had been a powerful and wealthy institution in Mexico for centuries, had been a key pillar of the old oppressive regime. They argued that the church's political and economic power had to be broken for Mexico to become a truly modern and democratic nation. They proposed articles that would strip the church of its land, its political influence, and its control over education. It was a radical and deeply controversial position, but for the delegates who had seen the church side with the old elites, it was a necessary one. In the end, the radicals won. The new Constitution of 1917, which was formally adopted on February 5th, 1917, was a truly revolutionary document. It was a testament to the power of the radical faction and a sign that the revolution, for all its chaos and its contradictions, had produced a truly groundbreaking piece of legislation. Article 27 of the Constitution declared that all land, water, and subsoil resources belong to the nation, giving the government the right to redistribute land and nationalize natural resources. Article 123 enshrined the rights of labor, giving workers an 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, and the right to strike. And a series of anti-clerical articles stripped the church of its legal status, its property, and its control over education. The Constitution of 1917 was a masterpiece of progressive legislation, a document that on paper was one of the most advanced in the world. It promised a new kind of Mexico, a nation that was based on social justice and economic equity. But the true test of the Constitution was not in its words, but in its implementation. Carranza, the man who had called the convention, was a moderate at heart. He had a deep respect for the document, but he was also a man who was wary of the more radical elements of his own revolution. The new Constitution was a powerful and revolutionary document, but it was now in the hands of a man who was, in many ways, its opposite. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one that would be fought not with guns, but with political will and the slow, grinding reality of governance. The Constitution of 1917 was a document of immense promise, a progressive masterpiece that enshrined the rights of labor and the peasantry and put the nation's vast natural resources under government control. It was, on paper, a revolutionary blueprint for a new Mexico. But the reality of implementing such a radical document was a different matter entirely. Venustiano Carranza, the man who had called for the convention and was now the de facto president, was a moderate at heart. He had a deep respect for the rule of law, but he was also a cautious politician who was wary of the more radical elements of his own revolution. He was, in a sense, a man caught between two worlds: the conservative elites who yearned for a return to the old order, and the radical revolutionaries who were impatient for change. The first challenge to the new Constitution came from Carranza himself, who was hesitant to implement its most radical provisions, particularly Article 27, which called for land reform. He believed that the nationalization of land and resources should be a slow, legalistic process, one that respected private property rights and did not disrupt the nation's economy. For the peasants and the revolutionaries who had fought for Tierra y Libertad, this was a profound and unacceptable betrayal. They had not bled and died for a slow, bureaucratic process. They had fought for immediate and tangible change. The promises of the Constitution were not being fulfilled, and the deep-seated anger and frustration that had fueled the revolutions in the first place began to resurface. Meanwhile, the conflict with the United States continued to cast a long shadow over the nation. The American government, which had recognized Carranza's presidency, was now deeply concerned about the radical provisions of the new Constitution, particularly Article 27, which threatened to nationalize the vast oil fields and mining operations that were owned by American companies. The diplomatic pressure on Carranza was immense. He was caught between his need to assert Mexican sovereignty and his desire to maintain a good relationship with his powerful northern neighbor. Historians still argue whether Carranza was a pragmatist who was simply trying to navigate a complex international situation, or a conservative who was quietly trying to undermine the radical constitution he had just approved. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but what is not in doubt is that the implementation of the Constitution was slow, hesitant, and for many deeply disappointing. While Carranza was struggling to govern, the remaining revolutionary factions were still a source of constant instability. Pancho Villa, though a spent military force, was still a kind of ghost in the north, launching sporadic raids and keeping the army on its toes. And Emiliano Zapata, in his southern stronghold, was still fighting his own private war for land reform. His movement, though isolated, was a constant reminder that the core issue of the revolution had not been addressed. The quiet, unyielding struggle in the South was a testament to the fact that for many Mexicans, the revolution was far from over. The political climate in Mexico City was also a source of deep-seated instability. The new government was plagued by corruption and a failure to address the nation's deep economic problems. The revolutionary heroes, many of whom were now generals and politicians, were often more interested in personal enrichment than in the public good. The promises of the revolution, so inspiring on the battlefield, were now being co-opted and corrupted by the very people who were supposed to be implementing them. It was a kind of a cruel irony, a slow-motion betrayal of the ideals that had started the war in the first place. The failure to fully implement the Constitution of 1917 was a crucial turning point. It was a sign that the political revolution had won, but the social revolution was still a distant dream. The Constitution, for all its progressive language, was not a magic bullet. It was a document that required political will and a leader who was willing to challenge the entrenched power of the old elites. Carranza, for all his dignity and his gravitas, was not that man. He was a man who had won a war, but was losing the peace. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, a struggle not against a dictator, but against the very institutions that the revolution had created. The year 1919 was a period of fragile peace, but beneath the surface, the political and military landscape of Mexico was still deeply volatile. Venustiano Carranza, now the officially recognized president, was trying to govern a nation that was still fractured and deeply divided. The Constitution of 1917, for all its revolutionary promise, remained largely unimplemented, a constant source of frustration for the peasants and workers who had fought for its principles. But the greatest and most enduring thorn in Carranza's side was not a political rival. It was a ghost of the revolution, a man whose quiet, unyielding struggle for land reform had never ceased. This man was Emiliano Zapata. For Carranza, Zapata was a constant problem, a kind of existential threat to the stability and legitimacy of his government. He was not a traditional military opponent who could be defeated in a conventional battle. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a phantom who melted into the rugged terrain of Morelos, and his army, though small, was a symbol of the revolution's unfulfilled promises. Carranza had tried everything to defeat him: military campaigns, political negotiations, and a propaganda war that painted Zapata as a common bandit. Nothing had worked. The Zapatistas were too deeply connected to the people and the land they were fighting for, and so Carranza's generals resorted to a different tactic. They would use deception and treachery to achieve what they could not achieve through force. A general named Pablo Gonzalez, who had been tasked with defeating Zapata, devised a plan that was as cynical as it was effective. He sent one of his officers, Colonel Jesus Guajardo, to pretend to be a defector from the Carranza army. Guajardo was to earn Zapata's trust, convince him that he was an ally, and then lure him into a trap. Guajardo was a master of his craft. He convinced Zapata that he was disillusioned with Carranza and that he wanted to join the Zapatista cause. He even went so far as to attack a federal garrison to prove his sincerity. Zapata, ever the trusting leader, was convinced. He agreed to a meeting with Guajardo at the Hacienda de Chinameca, a large estate that had once belonged to one of the wealthy landowners he so despised. It was, in a sense, a poetic meeting place, a symbol of the very thing he had been fighting against. On April 10th, 1919, Emiliano Zapata rode into the hacienda, a small force of his most trusted men by his side. As he approached the main gate, a guard of honor was lined up to greet him. The bugle sounded a call of honor, But as Zapata dismounted his horse, the soldiers raised their rifles and fired a volley of shots, killing him instantly. The betrayal was complete. The murder was a chilling and tragic end to the life of one of the revolution's most iconic and principled leaders. The assassination of Zapata sent shockwaves across the nation. The Carranza government, for all its protestations that it had simply been a military operation, was widely seen as a perpetrator of a brutal political murder. It was a moral blow to the legitimacy of the government and a sign that the revolution was still a brutal and unforgiving place. The death of Zapata was, in a sense, a final act of betrayal against the agrarian cause. He had fought for a singular principle, and he had been killed for it. His death, however, did not extinguish his movement. The Zapatistas, though leaderless, continued to fight, a kind of ghost army in the mountains. But his assassination did have a profound political effect. It removed the most radical and unyielding force from the national stage. Carranza no longer had to deal with the constant threat of a full-scale agrarian rebellion. The death of Zapata was a victory for the central government, a victory that was won not on the battlefield, but through an act of cold and calculated treachery. Historians still argue whether the murder of Zapata was a necessary act to bring about peace or a political crime that betrayed the very soul of the revolution. Whatever the reason, his death cemented his legacy as a martyr, a man who had fought for a cause and died for it. The revolution had lost its heart, and the stage was set for its final and perhaps most cynical phase. The assassination of Emiliano Zapata in 1919 was a devastating blow to the agrarian cause and a quiet victory for Venustiano Carranza. With Pancho Villa reduced to a bandit in the north and Zapata's movement decapitated in the south, Carranza was, for the first time, in a position of unchallenged power. He was now the master of Mexico, and he had a clear path to legitimize his rule through the upcoming 1920 presidential election. But Carranza's political instincts, which had served him so well in the war against Huerta, would now fail him in the peace. He was about to make a series of fatal miscalculations that would lead to his own downfall. Carranza, a man who had built his career on a platform of effective suffrage, no re-election, was now faced with the prospect of a new election. His most powerful and popular general, the brilliant Álvaro Obregón, was the obvious choice to succeed him. Obregón was a war hero, a man who had defeated Villa and brought a measure of stability back to the nation. He was widely popular and seen as a man who could finally fulfill the promises of the revolution. But Carranza, ever the proud and stubborn man, was not willing to let his power go so easily. He had grown to resent Obregón's popularity and his growing political influence. He saw him not as a successor, but as a rival. In a move that shocked the nation, Carranza announced that he would not support Obregón's candidacy. Instead, he chose a relatively unknown and politically weak civilian, Ignacio Bonillas, to be his successor. It was a classic case of a political boss trying to install a puppet president, a kind of sad echo of the very system he had fought so hard to overthrow. The choice was a profound betrayal of the revolutionary generals who had fought and bled for his cause. It was a clear signal that Carranza, for all his talk of constitutionalism, was not willing to let the democratic process unfold if it meant ceding power to a man he did not trust. The political situation quickly unraveled. Obregón, who had been patient and loyal for so long, was now left with a stark choice: accept the betrayal and fade into political obscurity, or fight for the presidency he felt he had earned. He chose to fight. He was supported by a new generation of revolutionary leaders, particularly a group of generals from the state of Sonora, a rugged, independent-minded region that had been a bastion of revolutionary fervor from the beginning. They were tired of the political corruption and the broken promises of the Carranza government. They saw Obregón as the only man who could bring a real sense of order and justice to the nation. Carranza's government, so secure just a few months before, was now facing a new and formidable challenge. The political machine he had so carefully built was now crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. The military, which had been so loyal to him in the war against Huerta, was now deeply divided. The old revolutionary generals, who had been sidelined by Carranza's political maneuvering, were now rallying behind Obregón. The president, who had once been the symbol of the New Mexico, was now looking more and more like the old dictator he had overthrown. It was a classic case of history repeating itself, a kind of tragic, self-inflicted wound. The political climate in Mexico City was becoming increasingly tense. The presidential campaign, which should have been a celebration of the new democracy, was instead a tense and bitter affair. The forces of Obregón and Carranza began to gather, a kind of quiet, ominous preparation for a new civil war. The public, which had been so weary of the constant conflict, now looked on with a sense of dread. The revolution, it seemed, was not over after all. It had simply entered a new and more complex phase, a struggle between the men who had won the war and the man who had been their political leader. The final act of this great drama was about to begin, and it would end, as so many revolutionary dramas do, with a betrayal. The political rift between Venustiano Carranza and Álvaro Obregón had now reached a breaking point. Carranza's attempts to impose his hand-picked successor, Ignacio Bonillas, were widely seen as a betrayal of the revolutionary principles he had espoused for so long. The old general, who had once been the symbol of the New Mexico, was now looking more and more like the very man he had overthrown, Porfirio Díaz. The sentiment of effective suffrage, no re-election, the very mantra that had started the revolution, was now being violated by its own leader. It was a tragic and ironic turn of events, a kind of self-inflicted wound. The conflict officially began with the Plan of Agua Prieta. This document, drafted and signed in April 1920 by a group of powerful generals from the state of Sonora, was a formal declaration of war against Carranza. The leaders of the Sonora Revolt were some of the most prominent figures of the revolution: Plutarco Elias Calles and Adolfo de la Huerta. The plan was a clear and direct response to Carranza's political machinations. It accused him of betraying the revolution and of violating the very constitution he had helped to create. It called for the removal of Carranza from power and the establishment of a provisional government that would be led by Obregón. The rebellion spread with a terrifying speed. The military, which had been so loyal to Carranza in the past, now sided with Obregón. The generals, who had felt betrayed by Carranza's choice, of a civilian successor, saw in Obregón a true leader, a man who had earned the right to govern through his service to the nation. The people, too, were on Obregón's side. They saw him as a hero, a man who could finally bring a sense of order and justice to the nation. The popular support for the Plan of Agua Prieta was overwhelming. It was a clear signal that the nation was tired of the endless political maneuvering and the broken promises. Carranza, in a desperate attempt to save his government, was forced to flee Mexico City. He was a man on the run, a kind of tragic echo of the old dictator he had overthrown. He and his loyalists, along with the National Treasury and the National Archives, boarded a train and headed towards Veracruz, the port city that had once been his base of power. But the train was repeatedly attacked by rebel forces, and the journey was a slow and perilous one. The man who had once been the symbol of a new kind of Mexico was now a hunted fugitive. The events that followed were a final, brutal act in the long and tragic drama of the Mexican Revolution. Carranza, unable to reach Veracruz, abandoned the train and, along with a small band of loyalists, fled into the mountains of Puebla. It was a desperate and futile last stand. He was betrayed by a local chieftain, a man who had once been a supporter but now saw an opportunity to get on the winning side. On the morning of May 21st, 1920, Venustiano Carranza was assassinated in a small village, his body found in a small hut. The official story, that he had committed suicide, was a transparent lie that fooled no one. The man who had led the Constitutionalist revolution was now a victim of the very violence he had so long presided over. The death of Carranza brought to a close a long and bloody chapter in Mexican history. The three great leaders of the revolution, Madero, Zapata, and now Carranza, were all dead, victims of the very political violence they had so long fought against. The power vacuum left by Carranza's death was now filled by Adolfo de la Huerta, who was installed as the provisional president, a kind of caretaker until the election of Obregón. The stage was set for a new kind of Mexico, one that would be led by the pragmatic and professional generals who had fought and won the war. The era of the idealists and the warlords was over. The era of the politicians and the strongmen was about to begin. With the assassination of Venustiano Carranza, the long, bloody chapter of the Mexican Revolution finally began to draw to a close. The nation, weary of a decade of civil war, was now ready for a period of stability, and the man who was poised to deliver it was the brilliant general, Álvaro Obregón. He was a pragmatist, a man who understood that the future of Mexico lay not in endless fighting, but in a new kind of politics. He was elected president in the fall of 1920, and his inauguration marked a profound shift in the nature of the revolution. The era of the idealists like Madero and the agrarian radicals like Zapata was over. The era of the professional revolutionaries, the men who had fought and won the war, had begun. Obregón's presidency was a period of relative peace and reconstruction. He was a master of political compromise, a man who was willing to work with a wide variety of people, from the old revolutionaries to the new politicians. He had a deep respect for the Constitution of 1917, and he was determined to finally implement its most important provisions. He began a massive program of land reform, distributing millions of acres of land to the peasants and the rural communities. It was a slow and difficult process, but it was a clear signal that the government was finally serious about fulfilling the promises of the revolution. He also began a program of educational reform, building thousands of schools and appointing the great muralist José Vasconcelos as his Minister of Education. The goal was to create a new national identity, one that was based on a sense of Mexican culture and a new post-revolutionary pride. But Obregón was not a man to be trifled with. He was a professional soldier who knew how to use force when he had to. He had a reputation for a ruthless efficiency, and he was not afraid to use it to quell the remaining rebellions. He was also a shrewd politician, a man who understood that power in Mexico was not just about winning elections. It was about building a political machine. He began to consolidate power, bringing the different military factions under the control of the central government. He was, in a sense, a kind of modern-day Porfirio Díaz, a man who was using his power to bring a sense of order to a chaotic nation. But unlike Díaz, Obregón was a man who was committed to the principles of the revolution. He was a kind of gentle autocrat, a man who was willing to use his power to bring about a more just society. One of Obregón's most crucial political tasks was to deal with the last of the great revolutionary leaders, Pancho Villa. Villa, remember, was still a kind of ghost in the north, a bandit who was still launching sporadic raids and a constant thorn in the side of the government. Obregón, in a move that was both a political and a pragmatic one, offered Villa a deal. In exchange for his surrender, Villa would be given a large hacienda in the state of Durango and a small pension. Villa, weary of a life on the run and with no hope of a military victory, accepted. The famous bandit-turned-general had in the end chosen to be a gentleman farmer. The deal was a sign that the revolution, for all its bloodshed and its violence, was finally coming to a quiet close. The retirement of Villa was a symbolic end to the era of the warlords. The nation was now in the hands of the politicians and the professionals. But even in retirement, Villa was a constant source of fear and suspicion. His old enemies, particularly some of the more conservative elements of the military, still saw him as a threat. And in 1923, Pancho Villa, a man who had survived a decade of war and a military expedition by the American Army, was assassinated in a hail of gunfire. The murder was widely seen as a political one, a kind of final, quiet act of revenge by the men who had once been his rivals. His death, for all its brutality, was a sign that the old era of the revolution was finally and truly over. The year 1924 marked a pivotal moment in the history of post-revolutionary Mexico. Álvaro Obregón, the brilliant general who had brought a measure of peace to the nation, was stepping down from the presidency. His decision to respect the no re-election clause of the Constitution of 1917 was a powerful signal that the era of the caudillos, the all-powerful military strongmen, was coming to a close. But the future of the nation was still uncertain. The revolution had produced a new class of leaders, but it had not yet produced a stable political system. The question was, who would succeed Obregón, and could the nation finally transition from a state of constant conflict to a state of stable, institutional rule? The answer came in the form of Plutarco Elias Calles, a tough and pragmatic general from the northern state of Sonora. Calles was a key figure in the Sonora dynasty, the group of politicians and military leaders who had supported Obregón and had brought down Carranza. He was a man of immense ambition and a deep commitment to the more radical principles of the revolution. He was elected president in 1924, and his presidency would mark a profound shift in the nature of the Mexican state. Calles was a modernizer, a man who wanted to build a new kind of Mexico, one that was based on economic development and social justice. He was, in a sense, a kind of revolutionary technocrat, a man who believed that the problems of the nation could be solved through a combination of scientific management and strong political will. Calles's presidency was a period of both great progress and great conflict. He continued the land reform program that Obregón had started, distributing more land to the peasants than any other president of the revolution. He also began a massive program of public works, building roads, dams, and schools, and he established a number of key government institutions, including the Bank of Mexico. He was a man who was determined to build a modern, secular state, and he was not afraid to use his power to get the job done. But Calles's most enduring and controversial legacy was his deep-seated anti-clericalism. The Constitution of 1917, remember, had contained a series of articles that were designed to strip the Catholic Church of its political and economic power. The articles were deeply offensive to many Mexicans who saw the Church as a central part of their identity and their culture. Carranza had been hesitant to implement the articles, but Calles was not. He was a fervent anti-cleric, a man who believed that the Church was a feudal and regressive force that had to be broken for Mexico to become a truly modern nation. In 1926, he began a harsh and uncompromising enforcement of the anti-clerical laws, closing down churches, expelling foreign priests, and banning public religious ceremonies. The result was a new and unexpected civil war, a brutal and bloody conflict that would be known as the Cristero War. The war pitted the government against a large and popular rebellion of conservative Catholics who were fighting for the right to practice their religion freely. The Cristero War was a kind of last gasp of the old conservative Mexico, a final and violent rejection of the secular modern state that Calles was trying to build. The war was a tragic and brutal affair, with both sides committing atrocities. It was a kind of sad and ironic end to a revolution that had started with a cry for political freedom. The conflict was not about land or suffrage. It was about faith and the very soul of the nation. It was a clear signal that the revolution, for all its victories, had not yet been able to fully unite the nation. The Cristero War, a brutal and unexpected conflict between the government and the Catholic Church, was the final bloody gasp of a decade of revolution. It was a war of ideals, a struggle between the secular, modern state that Plutarco Elias Calles was trying to build and the deeply traditional religious identity of the Mexican people. Calles, a man who had a deep and abiding faith in the power of the state, was not a man to compromise. He believed that the church was an obstacle to progress and that its political and economic power had to be broken for Mexico to become a truly modern and democratic nation. The Cristeros, a term that came from their cry of Viva Cristo Rey, or Long Live Christ the King, were a fierce and determined group of rebels who were fighting for their faith and their way of life. The war was a devastating and tragic affair. It was fought in the central and western states of Mexico, a region that was known for its deep-seated Catholicism. The Cristeros were not a conventional army. They were a guerrilla force, a kind of religious version of the Zapatistas, who used their deep knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They would ambush government troops, seize small towns, and then disappear back into the mountains. The government, for its part, responded with a brutal and uncompromising campaign of repression. They executed captured rebels, burned down villages, and committed a series of atrocities that would forever stain the reputation of the post-revolutionary government. The war was a profound and difficult moment for the Mexican people. It was a conflict that pitted neighbor against neighbor, and it exposed a deep and unhealed wound in the nation's psyche. It was a reminder that the revolution, for all its talk of unity and justice, had not been able to solve the fundamental question of what it meant to be a Mexican. Was it a secular, modern identity that was based on the principles of the state, or was it a deeply religious, traditional identity that was based on the principles of the church? The war was a clear signal that the two sides were not yet ready to coexist. The conflict also had a profound impact on the political landscape of Mexico. The war was a drain on the nation's resources, and it was a source of constant instability. Cowles, for all his determination, could not win the war outright. The Cristeros were too popular and too determined to be defeated in a conventional military campaign. In the end, the conflict was settled through a political compromise. The American ambassador at the time, Dwight Morrow, brokered a deal between the government and the church. The church agreed to suspend the rebellion, and the government, in turn, agreed to a more lenient enforcement of the anti-clerical laws. The war, for all its violence, had ended not with a victory for either side, but with a weary and uneasy peace. But the Cristero War, for all its tragedy, had a profound and lasting impact on the nature of the Mexican state. It was a clear signal to the government that it could not simply impose its will on the Mexican people. It was a reminder that the old ways, the old beliefs, were still a powerful and enduring force. It was also a sign that the revolution, for all its idealism, had not been able to create a truly unified and cohesive nation. The wounds of the war would take decades to heal, and the memory of the conflict would remain a powerful and enduring part of Mexican history. The presidency of Plutarco Elias Calles, for all its turbulence, was also a period of immense political innovation. He had, in a sense, finished the work that Obregón had started. He had brought a measure of stability to the nation, and he had established a new kind of political system, one that was based not on the rule of a single man, but on the rule of a single party. This was his most important and enduring legacy, and it was a legacy that would shape the future of Mexico for the rest of the 20th century. The revolution had, in a sense, come to an end, and the era of the institutional revolution was about to begin. The year 1928 was supposed to be a peaceful one. The Cristero War, a conflict that had consumed the nation, was drawing to a quiet, if uneasy, close, and the nation was preparing for a new, presidential election. Álvaro Obregón, the brilliant general who had brought a measure of stability to Mexico, was poised to make a political comeback. After respecting the no re-election clause and stepping down in 1924, he was now running again, having secured a constitutional amendment that allowed for a one-time re-election. His candidacy was widely popular, and he was the clear favorite to win. But the political landscape of Mexico was still a dangerous and unpredictable place. Obregón's victory was a foregone conclusion, but his inauguration would never come. On July 17, 1928, Obregón was attending a banquet in Mexico City to celebrate his electoral victory. As he was eating, a young man, a Catholic artist named José de León Toral, approached him under the guise of sketching a portrait. In a brutal and shocking act of violence, Toral pulled out a pistol and shot Obregón to death. The assassination was a political one, a final, tragic act of revenge for the government's brutal enforcement of the anti-clerical laws during the Cristero War. The man who had defeated Pancho Villa and brought an end to a decade of civil war was now a victim of the very violence he had so long presided over. The death of Obregón was a moment of immense crisis. The nation was leaderless, and the specter of a new civil war loomed over the country. The military, which had been so loyal to Obregón, was now in a state of shock and uncertainty. But in this moment of crisis, a man who had long been the power behind the throne now stepped into the spotlight. That man was Plutarco Elias Calles. Calles was a pragmatist, a man who understood that the future of Mexico lay not in a cycle of endless assassinations and power struggles, but in a new kind of political system. In a famous speech, he declared that the era of the caudillos, the military strongmen, was over. He said that the revolution had produced a new kind of institution, a political party that would be the true and lasting legacy of the conflict. And so, in 1929, Calles founded the National Revolutionary Party, PNR. The PNR was designed to be a political machine, a kind of institutionalized revolution that would bring all the various military and political factions under one umbrella. It was a kind of political genius, a way to channel the endless power struggles and the violent rivalries into a single cohesive organization. The PNR was a vehicle for the revolution, a place where the different factions could vie for power and influence without resorting to violence. It was a new and revolutionary way of governing, a system that would allow for a peaceful transfer of power. The creation of the PNR was the single most important political event in post-revolutionary Mexico. It was the moment that the revolution, which had been a kind of chaotic and unpredictable force, finally became an institution. It was a testament to the power of a single idea, a single act of political will, to change the course of a nation. The PNR would go on to rule Mexico for over 70 years, a testament to the political genius of its founder and a symbol of the end of the era of the warlords. The long and bloody cycle of assassination and betrayal was finally coming to an end. The revolution had, in a sense, eaten its children, and now it was finally ready to be a grown-up. The creation of the National Revolutionary Party, PNR, was a watershed moment. It marked the end of the violent, unpredictable era of the warlords and the beginning of a new, institutionalized phase of the revolution. Plutarco Elias Calles, The man who had founded the party was now the power behind the throne. For the next 6 years, a period known as the Maximado, he would rule Mexico not as president, but as the Jefe Maximo, or supreme chief of the revolution. He installed a series of puppet presidents, men who were loyal to him and who followed his political agenda. The political power in Mexico was no longer a matter of military might. It was a matter of being in good standing with the PNR and with Calles himself. The Maximado was a period of relative peace and political stability, but it was not without its conflicts. The Cristero War, remember, had left a deep and unhealed wound in the nation, and the relationship between the government and the church remained tense. The government, under Calles' guidance, continued to be deeply anti-clerical, and the social and economic reforms of the revolution were implemented slowly and inconsistently. But the most important thing about the Maximado was its political stability. The cycle of assassination and betrayal had been broken. The various factions of the revolution, from the old generals to the new politicians, were now a part of a single, institutionalized party. The power struggles were still there, of course, but they were now fought in the back rooms of the PNR, not on the battlefield. But the Maximado, for all its stability, was not a true democracy. It was a one-party state, a kind of benign autocracy that was ruled by the will of one man. The press was controlled, dissent was suppressed, and the elections, though they were held, were never in doubt. It was a kind of a sad and ironic end to a revolution that had started with a cry for effective suffrage, no re-election. The revolution, in its long and bloody journey, had ended up right where it had started, with a single man holding all the power. But unlike Porfirio Díaz, Calles was a man who was using his power to build a new kind of Mexico. He was a modernizer, a man who was committed to economic development and social progress. He was a kind of necessary evil, a man who was willing to sacrifice a little bit of democracy to bring a sense of order to a nation that had been in chaos for so long. The Maximado was also a period of immense economic development. Calles, with his deep belief in the power of the state, began a series of large-scale public works projects. He built roads, dams, and irrigation projects, and he began a program of industrialization. He was a man who believed that the future of Mexico lay in its ability to modernize its economy and to compete with the great industrial powers of the world. He was a man who was, in a sense, a kind of post-revolutionary CEO, a man who was determined to make Mexico a modern and prosperous nation. But even a man as powerful as Calles could not rule forever. The system he had created, the PNR, was a powerful and enduring force, and it would eventually outgrow its founder. The new generation of politicians, the men who had come of age in the revolution, were now ready to take the reins of power. They were tired of being ruled by a man who was not even the president, and they were ready for a new kind of leadership. The stage was set for the final act of the revolution, a peaceful, institutional transfer of power that would bring to an end the era of the caudillos and the strongmen. The revolution had, in a sense, finally become a grown-up, a mature and complex political system that was ready to face the challenges of the future. The year 1934 marked a profound shift in the political landscape of Mexico. The long, silent reign of Plutarco Elias Calles, the Jefe Maximo, was about to be challenged by a man who was, in many ways, his political heir. That man was Lázaro Cárdenas, a quiet, unassuming general from the state of Michoacán. Cárdenas had a deep and abiding respect for the Constitution of 1917, and he believed that the revolution had not yet fulfilled its most important promises. He had been a loyal supporter of Calles, but he was also a man who was deeply committed to the ideals of social justice and economic reform. He was, in a sense, a kind of revolutionary idealist in the body of a pragmatic politician. Cárdenas was chosen by Calles to be his successor, a move that was widely seen as a way to ensure the continuation of the Maximado. Calles, ever the shrewd political operator, believed that Cárdenas, with his quiet demeanor and his military background, would be a loyal and obedient puppet. But Calles had made a fatal miscalculation. Cárdenas was not a man to be controlled. He was a man with a vision for a new kind of Mexico, a vision that was far more radical and far more populist than anything Calles had ever imagined. Cárdenas began his presidency with a symbolic act of defiance. He moved out of the grand presidential residence and into a more modest home, a clear signal that he was not a man of the elite. He then began a series of bold and radical reforms that would forever change the course of Mexican history. His most important and enduring legacy was his commitment to land reform. He believed that the land, which had been the cause of the revolution, had to be returned to the people who worked it. He distributed more land to the peasants than all of his predecessors combined, a massive program of land redistribution that was a direct and powerful fulfillment of Emiliano Zapata's dream. He broke up the giant haciendas and created new ejidos, communal land holdings that were owned and operated by the local communities. It was a kind of a final, posthumous victory for the Zapatista movement, a triumph of the agrarian ideal that had been so long deferred. Cárdenas's presidency was also marked by his deep commitment to labor rights. He believed that the workers, who had been a key part of the revolution, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. He supported the formation of powerful labor unions, and he used his political power to mediate labor disputes, often siding with the workers against the powerful business interests. He was, in a sense, a kind of revolutionary labor leader, a man who believed that the state had a moral obligation to protect the rights of the poor and the marginalized. But Cárdenas's most audacious and controversial act was his decision to nationalize the nation's vast oil industry. The oil fields, which had been developed by American and British companies, were a symbol of foreign control over Mexico's natural resources. Cárdenas, in a move that was both an act of political defiance and an act of economic nationalism, seized the oil fields and put them under the control of a new state-owned company, Pemex. The move was a stunning display of political courage, a direct challenge to the power of the great international corporations. It was a clear and unambiguous signal that Mexico was no longer a puppet state and that its resources belonged to its people. The nationalization of the oil industry was a watershed moment. It was a kind of final, quiet victory for the revolution. It was a testament to the fact that the revolution, for all its bloodshed and its contradictions, had finally produced a leader who was willing to fulfill its most radical promises. The era of the idealists had ended, and the era of the institutional revolution had begun. The revolution had, in a sense, finally become what it had always promised to be, a force for social justice and economic equity. The presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas was a period of immense change, a kind of final flowering of the revolutionary ideals that had been so long in the making. He was, in a sense, the man who finally fulfilled the promises of the revolution, the man who took the Constitution of 1917 and turned it from a document of words into a document of action. But his legacy was not just in his land reform or his nationalization of the oil industry. His most important and enduring contribution was his commitment to the institutionalization of the revolution. He was the man who took the political machine that Plutarco Elias Calles had created and transformed it into a powerful and enduring force. Cárdenas understood that the power of the revolution was not in a single man, but in an institution that could outlive its founders. He began a systematic process of reorganizing the PNR, the National Revolutionary Party. He purged the party of the old military caudillos and the corrupt politicians who had been a part of the Maximado. He replaced them with a new generation of leaders, men who were loyal to the ideals of the revolution and who were committed to a new kind of institutional rule. He transformed the PNR into a more inclusive and representative party, creating four main sectors: the military, the labor unions, the peasant leagues, and a new popular sector that included professionals and small business owners. This new structure was designed to give a voice to all the major revolutionary groups and to ensure that the party was a true reflection of the nation. It was a kind of political genius, a way to channel the revolutionary energy into a single, cohesive force. The transformation of the party was a clear signal that the era of the caudillos was finally over. The power was no longer in the hands of a single military strongman, but in the hands of a powerful and enduring institution. The PNR, now renamed the Party of the Mexican Revolution, PRM, was a kind of perpetual revolution, a political machine that was designed to bring about change through peaceful, institutional means. It was a testament to the power of a single idea, a single act of political will to change the course of a nation. The long and bloody cycle of assassination and betrayal was finally coming to an end. But for all his political genius, Cárdenas was not a dictator. He was a man who believed in the power of the people, and he was a man who was willing to listen to their concerns. He traveled the nation tirelessly, visiting remote villages and listening to the stories of the peasants and the workers. He was a kind of a revolutionary populism, a man who was deeply committed to the idea that the government was there to serve the people, not the other way around. He was a man who was, in a sense, a kind of revolutionary hero, a man who had finally made the revolution a reality for the average Mexican. The presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas was a kind of final, quiet victory for the revolution. It was a testament to the fact that the revolution, for all its chaos and its contradictions, had finally produced a leader who was willing to fulfill its most radical promises. The era of the idealists had ended, and the era of the institutional revolution had begun. The revolution had, in a sense, finally become what it had always promised to be, a force for social justice and economic equity. The long and bloody journey of the Mexican Revolution was finally drawing to a close, and its legacy, a nation that was more just and more equitable, was finally beginning to take shape. The story of the Mexican Revolution is a long and complex one, a saga of betrayal and heroism, of idealism and cold, hard reality. It began with the quiet discontent of a nation, simmered under the long, stagnant rule of Porfirio Díaz, and exploded into a chaotic and unpredictable war. It was a revolution that was not a single, unified movement, but a collection of disparate struggles, each with its own leader, its own grievances, and its own vision for the future. It was a war of gentle idealists and ruthless warlords, of agrarian peasants and professional politicians. It was a conflict that in its long and bloody journey consumed its own children, a kind of tragic, self-inflicted wound that left a deep and unhealed scar on the nation. The revolution's legacy, for all its bloodshed, is a powerful and enduring one. It gave birth to the Constitution of 1917, a document that on paper was one of the most progressive in the world, a testament to the power of a single idea to change the course of a nation. It enshrined the rights of labor and the peasantry and put the nation's vast natural resources under government control. It was a document that, for all its slow and difficult implementation, was a kind of a revolutionary blueprint for a new Mexico. It was a promise of a new kind of society, one that was based on social justice and economic equity. But the revolution's most important legacy was not a document. It was a political system. The creation of the Party of the Mexican Revolution, PRM, and its later iteration, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, was a kind of political genius. It was a way to channel the endless power struggles and the violent rivalries into a single, cohesive organization. It was a testament to the power of a single act of political will to bring an end to a cycle of assassination and betrayal. The party, which would go on to rule Mexico for over 70 years, was a kind of perpetual revolution, a political machine that was designed to bring about change through peaceful, institutional means. It was a kind of an ironic end to a revolution that had started with a cry for political freedom, but it was also a testament to the fact that the revolution had, in the end, finally become a grown-up. The revolution, for all its triumphs, was a war that was fought on the backs of the forgotten people. It was a war that was fought by the peasants who yearned for their land, by the workers who toiled in the factories, and by the soldiers who died in the fields. It was a war that was fought not just by the great leaders, but by the countless men and women who risked their lives for a cause they believed in. And for many of them, the revolution did not end with a victory. It ended with a betrayal. It ended with the slow and difficult reality of a nation that was still struggling to live up to the promises that had been made. And so, the story of the Mexican Revolution sinks into legend, a tale of a nation that was willing to tear itself apart to be born again. It is a story of a people who, for all their suffering, never lost their sense of pride and their hope for a better future. It is a story that, like a great river, flowed through the heart of a nation, leaving behind a complex and enduring legacy. It left behind a legacy of a nation that was more just, more equitable, and more proud. It left behind a legacy of a people who had, in the end, finally found their voice. The moon is high now, a quiet lantern in the vast and endless sky, and the stars, like ancient memories, are beginning to fade. The long and turbulent story of a nation has come to a quiet close, and the men and women who fought so hard for a new future have finally found their rest. The dust has settled on the plains of Mexico, and the winds, so long filled with the sounds of war, are now silent, and as you close your eyes, you can almost hear the soft, final notes of a quiet song, a lullaby of a long ago revolution. A revolution that in the end finally found its way home. End of script. Sweet dreams.